Whimsy's eyebrows ascended a fraction of an inch, a gesture that those who knew him well had learned to interpret as the prelude to considerable mental activity. He lit his cigarette with deliberate slowness, allowing the smoke to curl upward, while his grey eyes remained fixed upon Mrs. Marchmont with an intensity that suggested he was reading not merely her words, but the precise architecture of her anxiety. "An absolute terror of electric shocks," he repeated softly. "How remarkably specific. One does not often encounter such a phobia without cause, Mrs. Marchmont. Childhood accident, a medical incident, or merely the sort of irrational dread that attaches itself to certain temperaments, the way some men fear open spaces or descents in lifts." Mrs. Marchmont rose and moved toward the window, where the garden beyond presented itself in tones of grey and dying green. "Edmund's terror was not irrational, Lord Peter. When he was 17, working in his father's electrical manufacturing concern, this was in Manchester, you understand, before the family came into this property, he received a shock of considerable severity. He was hospitalized for 3 weeks. The physicians believed at one point that his heart had been irreparably damaged, though subsequent examination proved them mistaken. Nevertheless, the experience left him with a profound and visceral fear. He would not enter rooms where electrical apparatus was being repaired. He insisted upon having all electrical fixtures in this house inspected quarterly by an independent engineer, and he maintained an absolute horror of wet conditions in proximity to such fixtures. Hence his insistence that the porch, which has a single electrical lamp mounted above the entrance, be covered and kept scrupulously dry. "How very telling," Whimsy murmured, and rose to his feet with the fluid grace that belied his considerable height. "And Dr. Hartwell examined the body in situ, I presume? Did not remove it or disturb the porch in any substantial way?" Mrs. Marchmont shook her head. "He pronounced death and suggested that Edmund be conveyed to the undertaker with all appropriate haste. Inspector Grayson arrived some hours later, examined the scene for perhaps 20 minutes, asked a few perfunctory questions, and departed satisfied that no criminal act had occurred. I did not know what to think, Lord Peter. I merely knew that something was dreadfully, catastrophically wrong." Whimsy moved toward the door with the purposefulness of a man who had developed a theory and wished to test it against observable fact. "Shall we examine this porch chair? I find that crime scenes, like old manuscripts, are most eloquently read by those who know how to listen to their silences. And a wet chair, left deliberately in proximity to an electrical fixture, in the home of a man whose phobia concerning electrocution was, by your account, profound and well documented. Well, that suggests either a most remarkable coincidence or a killer of considerable psychological sophistication." They proceeded through the hallway and into a side passage that opened onto a covered porch of considerable size, perhaps 12 feet by 10, its ceiling supported by wrought-iron pillars that had been recently painted a dull grey. The wicker chair in question occupied a position directly beneath the electrical lamp, which consisted of a brass fixture housing a simple frosted bulb. Whimsy examined it without touching, circling it slowly as though it were an artifact in a museum worthy of. Profound contemplation. The chair was indeed damp, though the dampness appeared to be confined to the seat cushion and the upper portions of the back. The floor surrounding it was entirely dry, which suggested that whoever had wet the chair had done so with care and precision, applying water in a manner calculated to produce maximum discomfort upon contact, rather than to create obvious evidence of foul play. Whimsy knelt beside it, producing from his pocket a small magnifying glass, a affectation, Mrs. Marchmont observed, that seemed entirely unnecessary given his evident powers of observation, and examined the legs and underside of the cushion with minute attention. "Salt," he said quietly. "The residue is crystalline rather than merely mineral. Seawater, perhaps, or a solution of salt water. How very deliberate. Salt water, being an excellent conductor of electrical current, would dramatically accelerate the lethal potential of any contact between wet skin and electrical apparatus, particularly if that apparatus had been, shall we say, subtly modified to deliver a greater voltage than its normal operational parameters would suggest. Dr. Hartwell, I imagine, would not have thought to examine the lamp itself for signs of tampering. Mrs. Marchmont's composure, which had been admirably maintained until that moment, showed its first genuine crack. "He did not," she said quietly. "I believe he was eager to avoid the complications that might arise from such examination. Edmund has no immediate family, you understand, but there are the questions of inheritance, of insurance, of potential liability if death were deemed to have resulted from negligence in the maintenance of electrical apparatus." Wimsey rose to his feet, dusting his trousers with methodical precision. "The question now becomes not merely who possessed the knowledge to effect such an alteration, Mrs. Marchmont, b. more importantly, who possessed the psychological insight to understand that Edmund Marchmont's terror of electrocution was so profound that he might be induced to sit in a wet chair beneath a tampered lamp, believing that the danger, however irrational, was real. That suggests someone who knew him intimately, someone who understood the precise architecture of his fears. Shall we discuss the household, Mrs. Marchmont? Who precisely had access to both Edmund and the electrical apparatus? And, more intriguingly, who stood to benefit from his demise? Mrs. Marchmont led him from the porch back into the drawing-room, where she seated herself with the deliberate care of someone whose nerves were beginning to assert themselves against her iron discipline. She poured tea from a pot that had been waiting on the sideboard, a gesture that Wimsey recognized as a mechanism for regaining composure rather than genuine hospitality, and began her recitation with the methodical precision of one accustomed to maintaining household accounts. "The household is small, Lord Peter. Edmund lived here with myself, my late husband's cousin, though I confess we were never particularly close, approximately 8 months ago, following the death of his wife. His own home in Surrey had been let to tenants, and he wished to economize. He was not, I should emphasize, a man given to extravagance, though neither was he burdened by any genuine financial constraint. He maintained a solicitor in London, Mr. Gerald Waverley, who manages his affairs with considerable competence. The household staff consists of Thomas, the servant you will recall discovered the body, who has been with the family for 17 years and is entirely reliable. There is Mrs. Helena Carstairs, the housekeeper, who has been here for 9 years and manages the domestic arrangements with admirable efficiency. There is also my daughter, Victoria, who resides here with her 2 children following her separation from her husband. Victoria is 31 years old, intelligent and, I should say, increasingly desperate regarding her financial prospects. Edmund had intimated, some weeks before his death, that he was considering making certain provisions in his will on her behalf, contingent upon her demonstrating greater seriousness of purpose. This was, I confess, a source of considerable friction between them. Wimsey sipped his tea with an expression of grave concentration, as though the beverage had suddenly revealed profound truths about the nature of domestic relations. How very illuminating! And what, precisely, constitutes greater seriousness of purpose in Edmund's estimation? Does your daughter harbor ambitions that Edmund deemed insufficiently earnest? Mrs. Marchmont's hands trembled slightly as she set down her own cup, and she made a visible effort to steady them. Victoria fancies herself an artist, Lord Peter. Watercolors primarily, though she occasionally attempts charcoal. Edmund considered art to be an acceptable pastime for unmarried women of leisure, but not a serious occupation deserving of financial support. He had suggested that she undertake some form of charitable work, or perhaps involve herself more substantially in the management of the household. Victoria found his suggestions offensive. They argued approximately 3 weeks prior to his death, with considerable acrimony. Edmund suggested that if she could not demonstrate a genuine commitment to self-improvement, he would ensure that any provision he made for her would be minimal and contingent upon her obtaining a respectable position in some commercial or charitable enterprise. A threat, in other words, thinly veiled in the language of paternal concern, Wimsey observed. And Victoria's financial situation, prior to Edmund's bequest, was entirely dependent upon your generosity. Mrs. Marchmont nodded, and Wimsey noted the slight compression of her lips that suggested she found this circumstance as regrettable as it was unavoidable. She receives a modest allowance from her separation settlement, but it is insufficient for the maintenance of her household and the education of her children. Her former husband, I regret to inform you, has proven entirely unreliable in the matter of continued support. Edmund's resources would have represented genuine security for her future. Whimsy rose and moved toward the window, where the garden had begun to dissolve into the grey certainty of approaching dusk. And Thomas, the servant who discovered the body, did he manifest any particular reaction to Edmund's death? Grief, certainly, but also relief, apprehension, or curiosity. Mrs. Marchmont considered the question with evident care. Thomas was, as he has always been, remarkably composed. He informed me of the discovery in a manner entirely consistent with his usual demeanour. He answered the police inspector's questions with straightforward brevity. I should have said that he was the last person one might suspect of involvement in any impropriety, but I confess that your question suggests I should perhaps examine my assumptions with greater rigour. Assumptions are the refuge of the complacent, Whimsy said, turning back from the window with an expression of mild amusement, though often they are merely the reflection of an observed reality. Tell me, Mrs. Marchmont, was Edmund a man inclined to routine? Did he maintain fixed hours, predictable habits, schedules that might have been anticipated by someone with intimate knowledge of his daily movements? Mrs. Marchmont's eyes narrowed slightly, and Whimsy perceived that his question had struck upon something she had perhaps not fully articulate, even to herself. Edmund was extraordinarily rigid in his habits, Lord Peter. He took his breakfast at precisely 8 o'clock each morning. He read the newspaper on the porch, weather permitting, at approximately 9:30. He maintained this schedule with almost mechanical regularity, even on Sundays. He claimed that such discipline was essential to the maintenance of mental acuity, that irregularity was the province of the idle and the morally corrupt. How very convenient for someone wishing to predict his movements, Whimsy murmured. And on the morning of his death, did he adhere to this schedule? Did anyone observe him proceeding to the porch at the anticipated hour? Mrs. Marchmont's composure visibly deteriorated, and she rose abruptly, moving toward the mantelpiece with the agitated movements of someone who had suddenly recognized the true implications of ordinary events. It was Thomas who discovered him, as I have said. Thomas brought the newspaper to the porch at 9:25, as was his custom. Edmund was already seated in the chair. Thomas assumed he had simply risen earlier than usual. He left the newspaper on the small table beside the chair and departed. When he returned at 10 o'clock to clear the breakfast things, Edmund was precisely as he had been left, motionless, the newspaper unread upon the table. It was only then that Thomas approached more closely and realized something was profoundly amiss. Whimsy's expression underwent a subtle transformation, the faint amusement that had characterized his demeanor shifting into something more contemplative, more dangerous. He returned to his chair with deliberate slowness, settling himself into its depths with the air of a man preparing to extract information from a complex and unreliable narrative. The question becomes, Mrs. Marchmont, whether Thomas's account of discovering Edmund already C. Ted in the chair at 9:25 is necessarily accurate, or whether it represents a convenient fiction designed to establish the precise moment at which Edmund's exposure to the electrical apparatus commenced. A man of 17 years' service, entirely reliable by your assessment, yet possessed of intimate knowledge of Edmund's habits, his fears, his schedule, and the technical specifications of the household's electrical apparatus. Tell me, has Thomas ever concerned himself with matters electrical? Does he possess any knowledge of wiring, of voltage, of the modifications that might be undertaken to transform an ordinary lamp into an instrument of lethal potential? Mrs. Marchmont's face had gone quite pale, and she reached out as though to steady herself against the back of her chair. I do not know, Lord Peter. I confess I have never inquired into the specifics of his expertise. He was trained as a gardener before entering domestic service. He has always seemed entirely ordinary, entirely content with his position here. Edmund relied upon him considerably. They had developed what I believe to be a genuine friendship, or at the very least a relationship of considerable mutual respect. Friendships, Whimsy observed with a note of philosophical detachment, are among the most lethal of human connections, precisely because they provide access unguarded by suspicion. A man will guard himself against an enemy, but he will sit in a wet chair at the behest of a trusted friend, particularly if that friend has carefully cultivated his fears rather than merely exploited them. He withdrew another cigarette from his case and lit it with methodical precision. But I am advancing too rapidly ahead of the evidence. Let us instead examine the matter of the electrical lamp itself. Has it been inspected since Edmund's death? Does anyone possess knowledge of whether modifications were indeed undertaken, or whether I am merely constructing theories upon the foundation of a wet chair and a dead man's phobia? Mrs. Marchmont moved toward the door with renewed purpose, her initial shock beginning to transmute into something more productive. The lamp remains undisturbed so far as I am aware. Inspector Grayson suggested that it be examined by the local electrician, but I could not bear the thought of strangers dismantling Edmund's belongings while he remained unburied. I instructed Thomas to ensure the porch was secured, and it has remained precisely as Edmund was found, save for the removal of the body itself, an admirable precaution, though motivated by sentiment rather than criminal investigation, Whimsy said, rising once more with the restless energy that Mrs. Marchmont was beginning to recognize as the prelude to action. Shall we proceed to the porch and examine this lamp with rather greater rigor than Dr. Hartwell seems to have managed? I should require a screwdriver, a pair of wire cutters if available, and perhaps a cup of tea. Not for drinking, I hasten to add, but for purposes of conductivity testing. Also, I wonder whether we might arrange a discreet conversation with Thomas. I find that servants often observe matters that their employers believe to be entirely private, and their motivations, when properly understood, frequently illuminate the most obscure aspects of a crime. They descended the staircase and proceeded through the hallway toward the porch, where the electrical lamp awaited with the innocent appearance of any ordinary domestic fixture. The afternoon light had begun to fade into genuine dusk, and Whimsy requested that the lamp be illuminated, which Mrs. Marchmont accomplished through a switch located within the house itself. The frosted bulb glowed with unremarkable warmth, casting a pale illumination across the covered expanse of the porch. Whimsy examined the fixture itself without immediately dismantling it, circling it with the focused attention he had earlier devoted to the wicker chair. He noted the precise positioning of the brass mounting, the manner in which the wiring emerged from the fixture and disappeared into the ceiling, the small accumulation of dust around the base where neglect and time had conspired to render the apparatus indistinguishable from any other object of household utility. "The wiring has been recently disturbed," he observed quietly, indicating a slight displacement in the dust pattern with a gesture of his cigarette. "You see how the accumulation has been partially cleared here, and here again. Someone with knowledge of the fixture has opened it recently, within the past fortnight I should estimate, though I confess such precision is somewhat beyond even my considerable abilities. Shall we proceed to its dismantling?" He requested the screwdriver, which Mrs. Marchmont procured from a small toolbox located in a closet adjacent to the porch. With practiced efficiency, Whimsy removed the brass cover plate and exposed the interior mechanism of the fixture. What he found caused him to emit a low whistle of appreciation, a sound that conveyed both admiration for technical competence and profound disapproval of its application. "Oh, how very clever," he murmured. "How remarkably, extraordinarily clever. You see here, Mrs. Marchmont, the standard household fixture contains a modest transformer that reduces the voltage to safe operational parameters. Someone has removed this transformer and replaced it with one of considerably greater capacity. Moreover, and this is the particular touch of genius, they have installed a secondary switch, concealed within the ceiling mounting, that permits the lamp to operate at either standard or elevated voltage depending upon which switch is activated. The public switch illuminates the lamp safely. The hidden switch delivers sufficient electrical current to prove fatal to any individual in contact with it, while simultaneously wet and grounded through contact with the earth or conductive surfaces." Whimsy descended from the chair he had climbed to examine the fixture and turned to face Mrs. Marchmont with an expression of grim satisfaction, which raises the question of who possessed not merely the motivation to murder Edmund Marchmont, but also the technical expertise and psychological understanding to construct such an elaborate apparatus. I believe, Mrs. Marchmont, that the time has come for us to conduct a rather more intensive inquiry into the movements and capabilities of your household staff. Particularly, I think, into the background and history of your servant Thomas, and whether his previous employment in his father's electrical manufacturing concern was perhaps more than a matter of innocent coincidence or fortunate family connection. Mrs. Marchmont stood motionless for a long moment, her face reflecting a struggle between the desire to defend a trusted servant and the dawning recognition that trust itself had been weaponized against her household. When she finally spoke, her voice had acquired a brittle quality, as though the careful maintenance of certainty had become untenable. Edmund's father was not a man in the electrical manufacturing concern, Lord Peter. Edmund himself worked there, as I mentioned. But Thomas— She paused, and Whimsy observed with clinical precision the moment at which her recollection underwent a fundamental reorganization. Thomas's father was employed there as well. I do not believe I was aware of this connection when Thomas entered our service. It was merely that Edmund required a gardener, and Thomas was available, and the arrangement seemed sensible. Edmund engaged him without consulting me regarding the matter. I confess I found this unusual at the time, though I attributed it to Edmund's characteristic independence of thought. How very interesting, Whimsy remarked, lighting yet another cigarette with an expression of profound concentration. And would you happen to know the circumstances of Thomas's father's employment at this manufacturing concern? Was he a worker of some standing, a man of technical expertise, or merely an ordinary laborer whose connection to the enterprise was superficial? Mrs. Marchmont's composure had begun to acquire a translucent quality, and she sank into the nearest chair with the appearance of someone who had suddenly perceived the magnitude of her own blindness. I do not know, Lord Peter. I have never inquired. Edmund seemed to regard the matter as settled, and I simply accepted that Thomas was satisfactory in his duties and left the matter to rest. Whimsy descended the porch steps and began to pace the garden with the rhythmic deliberation of a man whose mind was engaged in the complex process of assembling disparate elements into a coherent pattern. The question becomes not merely whether Thomas's father possessed expertise in electrical apparatus, but whether his employment at the manufacturing concern ended under circumstances that might have engendered a profound grievance. A man dismisses another man's father, or denies him advancement, or involves himself in some matter of financial injustice, and that man's son enters the household as servant, waiting with extraordinary patience for the opportunity to effect a revenge dressed in the garments of domestic accident. He turned back toward the porch, where the lamp still glowed with its deceptive innocence, and climbed once more to examine the concealed switch with meticulous attention. The technical execution air is remarkable, Mrs. Marchmont. This was not the work of an amateur, nor of a man motivated by sudden passion. This represents months of planning, of careful study, of precise understanding not merely of electrical apparatus, but of Edmund's psychological architecture. The perpetrator knew that Edmund would sit precisely where the electrical current could reach him. The perpetrator knew that Edmund's terror of electrocution was so profound that he would not examine the apparatus too closely, would not recognize the modifications that had been undertaken. The perpetrator knew that Edmund would not flee from a danger that existed only in his imagination because he had been carefully conditioned to believe that the porch lamp represented a genuine hazard of lethal proportions. But how could one condition a man to fear an apparatus he had presumably feared for decades? Mrs. Marchmont asked, her voice carrying the desperate quality of one grasping at logical reassurance in the face of overwhelming implication. Whimsy descended from the porch step and settled himself onto a garden bench with the air of a man preparing to deliver a particularly intricate lecture. One conditioned such a man by allowing him to believe that his fears were justified. Tell me, Mrs. Marchmont, in the weeks immediately preceding Edmund's death, did he express any incidents of minor electrical injury? A slight shock while touching a switch, perhaps, or a feeling of unusual sensation when in proximity to household wiring? Mrs. Marchmont's eyes widened with comprehension and horror. There was an incident, approximately 5 weeks ago. Edmund was in his study and reached for the wall switch beside the door. He reported experiencing an electrical shock, though a minor one. He was quite disturbed by it, and insisted that the house's entire electrical system be examined by an independent electrician. That inspection revealed nothing amiss, which Edmund found deeply troubling. He suggested that the apparatuses were becoming unstable, that the house itself was developing some sort of electrical malfunction that the inspectors were failing to identify. He became increasingly anxious about the matter, a planted incident designed to elevate his anxiety and thereby prime him for the final catastrophe, Whimsy said quietly. The perpetrator would have touched the switch with a concealed apparatus that delivered a minor shock, enough to terrify Edmund, not enough to cause genuine injury. The subsequent inspection would reveal nothing, which would reinforce Edmund's conviction that some mysterious, uncontrollable danger was present in his environment. By the time Edmund sat in that wet chair and reached toward the lamp, which he would have done, you understand, in an attempt to extinguish it or adjust its illumination, his psychological state would have been precisely calibrated to maximize his vulnerability to genuine electrical current. The question now becomes not whether Thomas is our perpetrator, but whether he acted alone or in concert with another member of your household who might have possessed both the motive and the opportunity to conspire with him in this elaborate destruction. Whimsy rose from the bench and began walking back toward the house, his pace deliberate and measured. I believe, Mrs. Marchmont, that the time has come for a frank conversation with both your daughter Victoria and your housekeeper Mrs. Carstairs. I suspect that one or both of them possessed information regarding Thomas's background that they chose not to volunteer to the police. Moreover, I should very much like to examine Edmund's study, particularly the desk where his correspondence was conducted and his financial affairs managed. A man like Edmund does not accumulate enemies with documenting the circumstances of those enmities, and if Thomas's father genuinely possessed grievance sufficient to motivate such an elaborate revenge, there will be documentation of that grievance somewhere within these walls. Edmund's study occupied the east wing of the house, a room of considerable proportions that reflected the tastes of a man who valued order and precision above aesthetic consideration. Heavy oak furniture dominated the space, and the walls bore the accumulated weight of decades of correspondence filed away in orderly rows. Mrs. Marchmont produced a key from the substantial ring she wore at her waist, and Whimsy observed with approval that Edmund had maintained sufficient privacy consciousness to lock his study door against casual intrusion. The desk itself was an impressive mahogany construction, its surface remarkably uncluttered, suggesting that Edmund had maintained the mental discipline to dispose of extraneous matter with systematic regularity. Whimsy settled himself into the leather chair behind the desk with the proprietary air of a man accustomed to examining other people's financial and personal affairs, and began his search with methodical precision. The correspondence was filed chronologically in drawers on either side, and Whimsy's fingers moved with practiced efficiency through the accumulated documentation of Edmund's affairs. 23 years of letters, he murmured, withdrawing a file marked with the year 1902. Precisely the period during which Edmund would have been establishing his authority within his father's manufacturing concern. The question becomes whether documentation of any significant dispute exists within this period. His search yielded results with remarkable speed, suggesting that either Edmund had been careless in his filing, or that some deliberate marker had been left to direct inquiry. Why? A series of letters, dated between 1903 and 1905, bore the letterhead of a manufacturing concern in Manchester, and they documented with devastating clarity a dispute of considerable proportions. The letters were written by one Frederick Ashford, identified as a works manager within the facility, and they detailed with increasing desperation a pattern of wage theft, of deliberate underpayment for overtime labor, and ultimately of dismissal without just cause or compensation when Ashford had begun to investigate the discrepancies. The final letter, dated February of 1905, contained language of such controlled fury that even at a distance of 2 decades its emotional force remained palpable. "You have chosen to steal from those beneath you with impunity," Ashford had written, secure in the knowledge that the law protects men of your standing from consequences that would see ordinary men imprisoned. "I do not forgive you, Mr. Marchmont. I do not forget. And if God grants me the means, I shall ensure that you account for every shilling you have stolen and every indignity you have inflicted upon men whose only offence was their poverty and their dependence upon your mercy." Whimsy withdrew the letters and laid them carefully upon the desk, his expression acquiring a quality of grim satisfaction. "Frederick Ashford," he said quietly, "a man driven to desperation by injustice, his career destroyed by Edmund's duplicity, his reputation ruined within the manufacturing circles of Manchester. And yet he had a son, Mrs. Marchmont, a son who might have inherited his father's sense of grievance along with his technical expertise. Tell me, was Thomas's surname Ashford?" Mrs. Marchmont's face had acquired the pallid appearance of wax, and she sank into the chair opposite the desk with an expression of profound distress. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, of course it was. Thomas Ashford. How could I have failed to make the connection? How could Edmund have employed the man without at least acknowledging the circumstances of their family's previous association?" Edmund did acknowledge those circumstances, Whimsy observed, returning his attention to the desk drawers. "He merely chose not to communicate that acknowledgement to you, which suggests that Edmund experienced either guilt regarding his earlier actions or fear that you would object to the employment of a man bearing such obvious cause for resentment. A man capable of such calculated cruelty as Edmund displayed toward Frederick Ashford is equally capable of understanding the vulnerability that such cruelty creates. Edmund invited Thomas Ashford into his household not from magnanimity, but from a desire to manage the danger by keeping it within sight. And yet in doing so, he sealed his own fate." Whimsy continued his methodical examination of the desk, moving now to a leather-bound journal that occupied a position of prominence within the central drawer. The journal proved to be Edmund's personal account of his business dealings, written in a hand that grew increasingly cramped and agitated as the years progressed. Whimsy's eyes moved rapidly across the pages, absorbing information with the rapidity for which he was renowned, until he encountered a series of entries dated approximately 6 months prior to Edmund's death. The entries documented Edmund's growing unease regarding Thomas Ashford's presence within the household. Edmund had apparently conducted his own investigation and discovered that Thomas's father, Frederick Ashford, had died in poverty in 1922. The circumstances of his death, suggestive of suicide brought on by financial desperation. Edmund had recorded his horror at this discovery with what appeared to be genuine remorse, and had subsequently begun contemplating whether restitution might be possible. However, the entries also revealed Edmund's terror that any acknowledgement of his guilt would render him vulnerable to blackmail or legal action. The final entry, dated 3 weeks before Edmund's death, contained language of such psychological anguish that even Whimsy's detached demeanour seemed to waver. "I have made arrangements with Waverley regarding certain provisions to be inserted into my will. Thomas will be provided for, though I confess I do so motivated more by fear than by genuine contrition. I sense that he knows. I cannot explain this conviction, yet it persists with terrible clarity. I feel that I am being watched, evaluated, judged according to standards I do not fully comprehend. The electrical incident last month has left me profoundly disturbed. I have begun to wonder whether the accident was truly accidental, or whether Thomas is attempting to communicate something through the medium of electrical apparatus. This thought is perhaps indicative of advancing paranoia, yet I cannot dismiss it entirely." "He knew," Mrs. Marchmont said, her voice barely audible. Somehow Edmund understood that Thomas bore him ill will, and yet he could not bring himself to dismiss him. Instead, he attempted to purchase forgiveness through financial provision. But Thomas's grievance was not financial, Lord Peter. It was personal. It was absolute. And Edmund's guilt, far from moderating Thomas's intention, simply accelerated his purpose. Edmund became increasingly trapped within his own terror, increasingly dependent upon Thomas's reassurance, increasingly vulnerable to manipulation. Whimsy closed the journal with deliberate care and returned it to its place within the desk, his movements characterized by the precision of a man performing a ritual whose significance extended beyond the merely mechanical. He rose from the chair and moved toward the window, where the gathering darkness had begun to transform the garden into an abstraction of shadow and uncertain form. "The question that now presents itself," he said quietly, "is whether Thomas Ashford acted in isolation or whether he possessed an accomplice. The electrical modifications suggest a level of technical expertise that might well be beyond the capacity of a man whose primary training was horticultural. Moreover, the psychological manipulation required to orchestrate Edmund's mounting terror speaks to a more sophisticated understanding of human weakness than one might expect from a servant motivated purely by inherited grievance. Tell me, Mrs. Marchmont, has Victoria exhibited any particular interest in electrical apparatus? Has she, in your observation, conducted any significant correspondence with individuals outside this household? And more importantly, has she at any point expressed to you her specific knowledge regarding the nature of Edmund's earlier employment in Manchester?" Mrs. Marchmont rose from her chair with movements characterized by visible reluctance, as though the physical act of standing represented an acceptance of the terrible implications that Wimsey's question contained. "Victoria has always been a curious child, Lord Peter, inclined toward intellectual pursuits that seem to exceed the expectations of her gender and social station. When she was younger, she conducted chemical experiments in the garden shed, much to her father's consternation. After her separation, during what I believe was a period of considerable emotional distress, she spent considerable time in the library studying technical literature. I confess I assumed this was merely a manifestation of intellectual restlessness, a means by which she might occupy her time and mind during a period of genuine unhappiness. But I do not recall her expressing any particular knowledge regarding Edmund's business history. Yet she would have had ample opportunity to acquire such knowledge," Wimsey observed, moving toward the study door with his characteristic fluid grace. "Edmund's correspondence is scarcely secreted away in any manner designed to exclude determined inquiry. A woman confined to domestic existence, seeking both intellectual stimulation and financial security, might very well undertake a systematic examination of the household's documents during periods when the master of the house was absent. And if Victoria had discovered Edmund's past transgressions, if she had perceived in his guilt the leverage necessary to manipulate both his behavior and his will, well, then she might very well have formed an alliance with Thomas Ashford, a man whose technical expertise could be subordinated to her psychological understanding of Edmund's specific vulnerabilities. They descended the staircase and proceeded to the drawing-room, where Mrs. Marchmont instructed a servant to request Victoria's presence with a formality that suggested she was steeling herself against the possibility of betrayal from one of her own blood. Victoria Marchmont entered the room perhaps 10 minutes later, her appearance characterized by the sort of theatrical dishevelment that Wimsey had come to recognize as the costume of artistic pretension. Her dress was carefully arranged to suggest bohemian indifference to conventional standards, and her hair had been arranged in a manner that implied recent agitation or recent emergence from creative fervor. However, her eyes, which were remarkably penetrating beneath their affectation of dreamy distraction, revealed an intelligence that was neither distracted nor dreamy, but rather intensely focused and acutely observant of every detail of Wimsey's bearing and expression. "Lord Peter Wimsey," Victoria said, extending her hand with a composure that suggested she was precisely aware of his identity and the significance of his presence within her household. "How unusual that my cousin's death should warrant the attention of such a celebrated detective. I confess I had imagined Scotland Yard's investigation to have concluded with the determination that Edmund had died of natural causes. Yet here you stand, examining us all with an expression of such penetrating skepticism that one might almost believe you suspected foul play." Wimsey accepted her hand and subjected it to minute examination, under the pretense of conventional greeting. The hands of an artist, he observed, would typically bear evidence of paint, charcoal, or other media. Victoria's hands, by contrast, were remarkably clean, precisely maintained, and bore subtle calluses on the fingertips consistent with the handling of small mechanical apparatus, rather than artistic implements. "Miss Marchmont," he said, settling himself into a chair with the casualness of a man confident in his own perceptions, "I wonder whether you might elucidate for me the nature of your intellectual pursuits during the period following your separation from your husband. Your mother recalls that you devoted considerable time to technical literature. I find myself curious regarding the specific nature of that literature and the reasons that prompted such study. Victoria's expression underwent a subtle shift, the veneer of artistic distraction acquiring the hardness of polished steel. I was attempting to understand the world beyond the narrow confines of domestic existence, Lord Peter. Is that a crime? I was attempting to acquire knowledge that might provide me with genuine independence, genuine security, in a world that offers women precious few legitimate means by which to achieve either. My watercolors would never support me. My separation left me with minimal resources and no prospects of remarriage to a man of adequate means, and my cousin— She paused, and Whimsy observed with clinical precision the moment at which her carefully constructed composure threatened to fracture beneath the pressure of accumulated resentment. My cousin sat in his study, surrounded by his stolen wealth, purchased through the exploitation of men too poor to resist him, and offered me the prospect of financial security contingent upon my abandoning every aspiration, every ambition, every aspect of my identity that made existence tolerable. And Thomas Ashford, Whimsy said quietly, presented an alternative means by which financial security might be achieved, a man whose father had been destroyed by Edmund's predatory practices, whose own presence within this household was motivated by carefully constructed revenge, whose technical expertise might be subordinated to your psychological understanding of human manipulation. Tell me, Miss Marchmont, was it your intention from the beginning to orchestrate Edmund's death, or did the opportunity present itself gradually, as Edmund's guilt and fear rendered him increasingly vulnerable to manipulation? Victoria remained motionless for a prolonged moment, her hands folding with deliberate precision in her lap, and when she finally spoke, her voice had acquired a quality of crystalline clarity that suggested the abandonment of all pretense. "You are remarkably perceptive, Lord Peter," she said quietly, "though I confess I find myself uncertain whether your perception constitutes triumph or merely the inevitable conclusion toward which all careful observation must inevitably progress. The answer to your question is neither entirely one nor entirely the other. Thomas approached me approximately 8 months ago, shortly after Edmund had engaged him as servant. He presented himself with an extraordinary candor that I found simultaneously terrifying and compelling. He explained his family's history, his father's destruction, his own decades of patient accumulation of knowledge and opportunity. He asked me whether I possessed any sympathy for his purpose, or whether I would regard him as merely another criminal motivated by base revenge. I was, I confess, initially horrified. But as Thomas explained the specifics of his situation, as he detailed the manner in which Edmund had systematized cruelty toward those beneath him, I found myself gradually reconsidering the moral architecture within which such judgments are typically constructed. Mrs. Marchmont had begun to weep quietly, her hands trembling as she attempted to maintain some semblance of composure. Victoria glanced toward her with an expression that might have been regret, or might have been merely the reflection of her own internal conflict made visible through facial movement. "I did not intend for my mother to suffer," Victoria continued, her eyes returning to Whimsy. "That remained a constant consideration throughout the planning and execution of our design. Thomas and I discussed extensively the manner in which Edmund's death might be accomplished without casting suspicion upon this household or upon my mother's reputation. We concluded that an apparent death from natural causes, attributed to cardiac failure, would be the most merciful resolution for all parties concerned. Edmund would be removed from the world, his accumulated wealth would pass to his heirs according to the provisions he had established in his will, and Thomas would depart with sufficient financial provision to begin again somewhere far removed from this place and from his father's memory. "How very thoughtfully conceived," Whimsy observed, his tone acquiring a quality of such profound irony that the words seemed to carry layers of meaning entirely distinct from their surface significance. "And yet the plan contained a fundamental flaw, did it not? You and Thomas apparently failed to account for the possibility that Edmund's death might be regarded with sufficient suspicion to warrant investigation. You failed to anticipate that an individual such as myself might be summoned to examine circumstances that ordinarily would pass without scrutiny. Tell me, Miss Marchmont, was it mere oversight, or did you harbor a subconscious desire to be discovered? Does not all carefully constructed revenge contain within it an element of performative necessity? A killer who remains unknown, whose crime passes as accident, experiences none of the satisfacti, none of confrontation, none of the psychological validation that comes from forcing others to recognize the magnitude of his or her grievance? Victoria's expression underwent a subtle transformation, and Whimsy perceived with clinical precision the moment at which his observation struck upon a truth that she herself had perhaps not fully acknowledged. "You are suggesting," she said slowly, "that on some level beneath conscious thought I desired to be caught. That the elaborate nature of our scheme, the precise documentation of Edmund's electrical fears, the carefully planted incident designed to elevate his anxiety, all of this represented not merely a means to an end, but rather a form of testimony, a means by which I might communicate to someone with sufficient intelligence to understand the full scope of Edmund's crimes and the justice, however extra-legal, that his death represented." "I am suggesting nothing of the sort," Whimsy replied with characteristic precision. "I am merely observing that human psychology contains depths and contradictions that often escape the conscious awareness of those who harbor them. You and Thomas constructed an elaborate apparatus of revenge, precisely calibrated to exploit Edmund's specific vulnerabilities. You orchestrated a campaign of psychological manipulation designed to render him increasingly dependent upon Thomas's reassurance and increasingly vulnerable to the final catastrophe. And yet simultaneously, you provided sufficient evidence to allow investigation to proceed along a clear logical pathway toward your inevitable discovery. One might interpret this as an act of unconscious sabotage, or one might interpret it as a deliberate communication, a message directed toward anyone possessed of sufficient intelligence to read it, stating that Edmund Marchmont's death was not tragedy, but rather justice achieved through extraordinary means." Mrs. Marchmont had risen from her chair and moved toward the window, where she stood with her back to both Whimsy and her daughter, her shoulders bearing the visible weight of familial betrayal and complicity through ignorance. "How long?" she asked quietly, her voice barely audible. "How long have you known Victoria? How long have you been deceiving me regarding your activities and your associations?" Victoria's composure wavered for the first time, and Whimsy observed with some sympathy the genuine struggle that her mother's question provoked approximately 6 months prior to Edmund's death. "We began the active phase of our planning," Victoria said quietly. "The remainder of the time was devoted to preparation, to ensuring that the electrical apparatus would function precisely as designed, and to conditioning Edmund's psychological state through the planted incident and through careful manipulation of his anxieties regarding household safety. I did not speak of it to you, Mother, because I could not bear to see your face when you understood what I had done. I could not bear to witness your moral recrimination, your disappointment in me as your daughter, your recognition that I had become something you could not reconcile with your understanding of who I was." Whimsy rose from his chair and moved toward the door with the purposeful air of a man whose investigation had reached its natural conclusion. "The question that now remains to be determined is precisely what shall be done with this knowledge. Thomas Ashford, I presume, is no longer within the household. He has fled with whatever provisions he and Miss Marchmont had arranged for his departure." Victoria nodded, and Whimsy continued with characteristic detachment. "Then the matter becomes not one of immediate arrest and prosecution, but rather one of careful deliberation regarding the precise man in which justice shall be served. I wonder, Mrs. Marchmont, whether we might retire to the study and discuss this matter in private. There are aspects of the situation that warrant consideration beyond the immediate legal implications of the crimes that have been committed." The study had acquired a different character in the gathering darkness, the orderly arrangement of correspondence and personal documents seeming to carry now an air of accusation rather than mere administrative precision. Whimsy settled himself into Edmund's leather chair, with a gesture that suggested he was resuming a conversation interrupted by temporary distraction rather than initiating a wholly new line of inquiry. Mrs. Marchmont remained standing, her posture suggesting a determination to maintain physical distance from the seat that Edmund had occupied, as though proximity to it might constitute some form of complicity or contamination. "The question that presents itself," Whimsy began, lighting a cigarette with methodical precision, "is not whether Victoria Marchmont and Thomas Ashford conspired to murder Edmund Marchmont. The evidence on that point is unambiguous. Rather, the question becomes whether that conspiracy constitutes a crime deserving of prosecution, or whether it represents an act of extrajudicial justice that falls into a category of moral complexity that our legal system is singularly ill-equipped to address. Edmund Marchmont was, by any objective standard, a man who systematically exploited those beneath him, who accumulated wealth through predatory practices, who destroyed Frederick Ashford's life with deliberate malice and subsequently engaged Frederick's son as servant, while experiencing sufficient guilt to contemplate financial restitution without offering genuine acknowledgement of his crimes. One might construct an argument suggesting that Edmund's death represents no murder, but rather the inevitable consequence of actions undertaken with full knowledge of their moral weight. Mrs. Marchmont finally sank into a chair, her resistance to the implications of Whimsy's argument apparently exhausted by the accumulation of terrible knowledge. "You are suggesting that we should not report Victoria's crime to the police? That we should allow a murderer to escape justice?" Her voice carried a note of incredulity mingled with desperate hope, as though she simultaneously desired both Whimsy's reassurance and his confirmation that such reassurance was impossible to provide. Whimsy regarded her with an expression of profound contemplation, his grey eyes carrying depths that suggested considerable internal debate regarding the answer that propriety and justice demanded. "I am suggesting," he said slowly, "that before we undertake any action that would inevitably result in Victoria's arrest and subsequent trial, we must carefully examine the precise consequences of such action and determine whether those consequences represent a desirable outcome from the perspective of justice itself. The legal system exists to protect society from dangerous criminals and to deter future criminal activity through the promise of punishment. Victoria Marchmont is neither particularly dangerous nor likely to engage in future criminal activity. Thomas Ashford, by contrast, appears to have entertained genuine hopes that his elaborate revenge might somehow constitute a form of reparative justice for his father's destruction. Once that revenge had been accomplished, once Edmund had been removed from the world, I suspect that Thomas would have preferred to disappear quietly and establish a new existence far removed from the scene of his vengeance. "And what of the law itself?" Mrs. Marchmont asked, her voice acquiring a note of desperate pragmatism. "Surely the law exists precisely because private individuals cannot be permitted to undertake their own justice, however justified they might believe their actions to be. If we conceal this crime, are we not ourselves becoming criminals? Are we not complicit in the very corruption of legal principle that Edmund's actions represented?" Whimsy rose from the chair and moved toward the window, where the darkness had become complete and the glass reflected only his own image and that of the study behind him. "You are entirely correct, Mrs. Marchmont. The law exists to prevent precisely the sort of extrajudicial justice that Victoria and Thomas undertook, and yet the law is also an instrument of tremendous potential injustice, particularly when it is applied without regard for the moral context in which criminal acts occur. I pose to you a hypothetical situation. If a man attacked a child, if you intervened and killed that man in defense of the child, would you consider yourself a murderer? Would you regard the legal consequences of your action as appropriate punishment for an act undertaken to prevent genuine harm? That is entirely different," Mrs. Marchmont protested. Though her voice carried less conviction than her words suggested, Victoria did not act in immediate defense of anyone. She undertook a prolonged conspiracy to commit murder, deliberately manipulated Edmund's psychological state, and orchestrated his death with calculated precision. There is no immediacy, no genuine necessity, no element of spontaneous response to imminent danger. She is not a woman who acted to prevent ongoing harm. She is a woman who orchestrated revenge for past injustice. "And yet," Whimsy replied, turning from the window to face her directly, "one might argue that Frederick Ashford's death, a death that occurred years before Victoria was even born, represented ongoing and irreversible harm to Thomas Ashford and his family. One might argue that Edmund's systematic exploitation of those beneath him constituted ongoing injustice, perpetuated through his accumulation and maintenance of stolen wealth, continuing day after day until the moment of his death. The question becomes not whether Victoria's actions were legally justified, but rather whether they represented a response to genuine injustice that our legal system had failed to address. Wimsey moved toward the desk and withdrew the correspondence that documented Edmund's treatment of Frederick Ashford, laying it carefully before Mrs. Marchmont. "These letters, Mrs. Marchmont. Has Edmund ever made any effort to restore the wealth he stole from Frederick Ashford? Has he ever attempted to contact Ashford's family, to offer restitution, to acknowledge the injustice he had committed?" The answer, which his journal entries make abundantly clear, is no. Edmund experienced guilt, certainly. Edmund contemplated making financial provisions to Thomas in his will, undoubtedly motivated by anxiety regarding his own safety rather than by genuine contrition. But Edmund never once acknowledged the fundamental immorality of his actions toward Frederick Ashford. Edmund never once treated the victim of his cruelty as anything other than a threat to be managed through financial manipulation. Mrs. Marchmont sat in silence for a prolonged moment, her hands trembling as she attempted to reconcile the demands of law with the whispered suggestions of moral complexity. "What do you propose, Lord Peter?" she finally asked, her voice barely audible. "What course of action do you believe I should undertake?" Wimsey returned to the desk and lit another cigarette, his expression acquiring the quality of profound fatigue that came from contemplating moral questions that admitted of no entirely satisfactory resolution. "I propose," he said quietly, "that we allow Inspector Grayson to conclude his investigation with the determination that Edmund Marchmont died of natural causes, precisely as Dr. Hartwell initially suggested. I propose that the electrical apparatus be removed from the porch lamp by a qualified electrician and disposed of discreetly. I propose that Victoria remain here with you, attempting to rebuild her life with somewhat greater financial security than she possessed prior to Edmund's death. And I propose that you allow me to depart from Colebrook with the full knowledge that justice, however imperfect and however incompletely served by the operation of law, has nonetheless been achieved through means that fall outside the legitimate purview of legal authority." Mrs. Marchmont's reaction to Wimsey's proposal manifested itself not in immediate assent, but rather in a prolonged struggle that played across her features with the transparency of a woman unaccustomed to concealing her inner conflict. She rose from her chair and moved toward the desk, where she stood for several moments, examining the letters from Frederick Ashford as though they were documents of profound historical significance rather than mere evidence of personal injustice. "You are asking me to become complicit in a conspiracy to pervert the course of justice," she said finally, her voice carrying a note of exhaustion that suggested she understood the precise nature of what Wimsey was proposing and the moral costs that such compliance would inevitably exact. "You are asking me to lie to the authorities, to suppress evidence of a crime, to allow a murderer to escape the legal consequences of her actions. You are asking me to prioritize my daughter's welfare and the preservation of my household's reputation over my obligation to the law and to society itself. I am asking you to consider," Wimsey replied with characteristic precision, "Ion, whether the law and society itself benefit from the prosecution of a woman who conspired to remove from the world a man whose entire existence had been predicated upon the systematic exploitation of those beneath him. I am asking you to weigh the benefit to justice that would accrue from Victoria's conviction and imprisonment against the benefit to justice that has already accrued from Edmund's death and the removal of his predatory influence from positions of power and privilege. I am asking you, in other words, to engage in the sort of moral calculation that philosophers have debated for centuries, and that I do not presume to answer with absolute certainty." He paused, allowing his cigarette smoke to drift upward in the stillness of the study. "However, I will observe that Inspector Grayson has already concluded his investigation to his satisfaction." The local physician has documented Edmund's death as natural. There exists no forensic evidence linking Victoria or Thomas to the crime, provided the electrical apparatus is removed with appropriate discretion. The only remaining obstacle to the quiet closure of this matter is your own conscience and your determination regarding whether that conscience is best served by silence or by report. The door to the study opened abruptly, and Victoria entered with the purposeful stride of someone who had resolved upon a course of action and intended to pursue it regardless of external objection. Her appearance had changed subtly in the interval since Whimsy's confrontation of her guilt. Her hair had been arranged with greater care, her dress adjusted to conventional propriety, and her entire demeanor suggested the abandonment of artistic pretense in favor of a kind of stark honesty. "I will not allow my mother to bear the burden of my crimes through silence," Victoria said without preamble. "I appreciate your proposal, Lo. R&D Peter, and I recognize that it emerges from a sincere, if morally ambiguous, desire to achieve a form of justice that the law itself cannot provide. However, I cannot accept it. I cannot permit my mother to carry through the remainder of her life the knowledge that she has conspired to conceal murder, that she has subordinated her principles to my welfare and my self-preservation. Such knowledge would poison everything, and I would not inflict such poison upon her out of regard for my own comfort or security." Mrs. Marchmont turned toward her daughter with an expression of such profound anguish that Whimsy found himself obliged to look away, recognizing that he was witnessing an intimacy of family tragedy that propriety suggested he should not observe. "Victoria, you cannot mean this. You cannot deliberately submit yourself to arrest, to trial, to the systematic destruction of your life that such proceedings would inevitably entail. I cannot permit you to do this." Victoria moved toward her mother and took her hands with a tenderness that seemed entirely at odds with the woman who had orchestrated Edmund's death with such calculated precision. "You did not permit me to do anything, Mother. I did what I believed to be necessary, and I did so with full understanding of the consequences that might follow. I cannot now betray that understanding by accepting protection purchased through your complicity in my crime. Such protection would constitute not mercy, but rather a fundamental corruption of the person I believe myself to be." Whimsy observed this exchange with the detached clarity of a man who had witnessed many such moments of moral reckoning, and who had learned that such moments rarely admitted of convenient resolution. He moved toward the study door with the deliberate movements of someone who recognized that his presence had become somewhat extraneous to the doctor. Drama that was unfolding before him. "I shall, of course, make my report to Inspector Grayson," he said quietly. "I will inform him that my investigation has revealed certain irregularities in the circumstances of Edmund's death that warrant further examination. I will present to him the evidence regarding the electrical apparatus, the correspondence documenting Edmund's earlier predatory actions, and the logical chain of inference that connects these various elements to a coherent theory of the crime. I will provide him with sufficient information to allow him to conduct his own investigation and to reach his own conclusions regarding whether charges ought to be brought." He paused at the threshold, his hand upon the doorframe, and turned back toward the two women with an expression that suggested he had encountered something that challenged his characteristic detachment. "However," he continued, "I will also suggest to him that certain matters are most appropriately handled through means that do not necessarily involve the machinery of official prosecution. I will observe that evidence, while suggestive, is not absolutely conclusive. I will note that the victim, however deplorable his conduct, cannot himself testify regarding the manner in which he was killed. I will, in other words, provide Inspector Grayson with the information necessary to reach a determination of guilt, while simultaneously suggesting that certain discretionary factors might appropriately influence the manner in which that determination is subsequently addressed." He withdrew a cigarette case from his pocket and offered it toward Victoria, who declined with a small shake of her head. "You have demonstrated, Miss Marchmont, a degree of moral courage that is lamentably rare in modern society. Whether that courage will ultimately be regarded as admirable or merely as foolish will depend entirely upon the decisions made by Inspector Grayson and the Crown Solicitor regarding how to proceed with this matter. I do not control those decisions, and I would not presume to do so. Inspector Grayson arrived at Colebrook the following morning, his appearance characterized by the sort of professional courtesy that suggested he had been apprised of Whimsy's findings, and had determined that investigation of a more rigorous nature was indeed warranted. He was a man of perhaps 55 years, bearing the accumulated weight of a career spent navigating the often contradictory demands of law enforcement and justice, and his expression suggested that he had encountered sufficient moral ambiguity in his professional experience to regard Whimsy's findings with something approaching resignation rather than surprise. The examination of the electrical apparatus proceeded with methodical precision, and within the hour Grayson had confirmed Whimsy's observations regarding the modifications that had been undertaken to render the lamp a weapon of lethal potential. He examined the letters documenting Edmund's treatment of Frederick Ashford with visible discomfort, and he conducted interviews with Victoria and Mrs. Marchmont that were characterized by a peculiar quality of restraint, as though he was asking questions that he did not entirely wish to have answered. By midday, he departed with the electrical apparatus secured in his motor car, and he carried with him as well the journal entries, in which Edmund had documented his growing anxiety regarding Thomas Ashford's presence within the household. 3 weeks passed before Whimsy received word from Inspector Grayson regarding the disposition of the investigation. The letter, written in a careful hand that suggested its composition had required considerable deliberation, informed Whimsy that a warrant had been issued for the arrest of Tom, as Ashford in connection with the death of Edmund Marchmont, and that inquiries regarding Ashford's whereabouts were being conducted through channels both official and informal. However, the letter continued, no charges had been brought against Victoria Marchmont, a decision that appeared to rest upon the determination that, while the evidence suggested her involvement in the conspiracy, the precise legal categorization of that involvement remained subject to interpretation. The electrical apparatus had been examined by Scotland Yard specialists who confirmed that it represented a sophisticated modification undertaken by someone possessing considerable technical expertise. The Crown Solicitor, the letter concluded, had determined that while the circumstantial evidence was compelling, the absence of direct testimony regarding Victoria's specific actions rendered prosecution questionable in terms of likelihood of conviction. Therefore, it had been decided that further investigation would be pursued with regard to Thomas Ashford's whereabouts and activities, while no immediate action would be undertaken regarding Miss Marchmont pending the outcome of such investigation. Whimsy responded to Grayson's letter with a brief note expressing his satisfaction that the matter was proceeding toward appropriate resolution, and he did not mention the observation that Grayson's letter seemed to contain precisely the sort of discretionary interpretation that one might expect from a man who had determined that certain crimes were better left unprosecuted when the victim had been sufficiently culpable and the perpetrators motivated by something more complex than base criminality. He returned to London and resumed his customary existence, attending theatrical performances, conducting consultations regarding matters of criminal investigation, and maintaining the sort of social engagement that seemed to constitute the primary occupation of a man of his social standing and independent means. However, he maintained a continuing correspondence with Inspector Grayson regarding the search for Thomas Ashford, and he noted with interest that the search seemed to proceed with a quality of deliberation that suggested Grayson was not particularly eager to locate the fugitive with excessive speed or efficiency. 7 months after Edmund Marchmont's death, Whimsy received a letter bearing a postmark from Buenos Aires. It was written in a careful hand, and it contained no signature, merely a brief message. Lord Peter, I have settled in a place far removed from the scenes of my former misery. I have begun a new existence under circumstances of modest comfort, purchased through the provisions that Edmund's will has provided. I have not forgotten my father, nor have I abandoned the memory of his suffering. But I have come to understand that vengeance, however justified, does not restore what has been lost or repair what has been destroyed. I go forward now with the hope that my father's memory might be honored not through continued bitterness, but through the attempt to live with greater generosity and greater kindness than Edmund displayed toward those beneath him. I trust that Lord Peter's investigation has reached conclusions consistent with justice, however imperfectly that justice might be served by the machinery of law. I remain grateful for his understanding and his discretion. The letter was unsigned and contained no return address, but Wimsey recognized in its composition and sentiment the hand of Thomas Ashford, and he filed it carefully among his personal papers with the sort of reverence usually reserved for documents of considerable historical significance. Victoria Marchmont did not remain in Coldbrook indefinitely. Within a year of Edmund's death, she had relocated to London, where she established herself as an illustrator of technical manuals, a profession that allowed her to utilize both her artistic sensibilities and her acquired knowledge of electrical apparatus and mechanical systems. She never again attempted to present herself as a painter or creative artist, but rather accepted the legitimate work of technical illustration as sufficient compensation for her talents and her education. Her children prospered, and she maintained a correspondence with her mother that suggested a relationship reformed upon the foundation of greater honesty and mutual understanding than had previously existed. She never married again, and she became known in certain circles as a woman of considerable independence and unusual expertise, though the circumstances that had prompted her acquisition of such expertise remained forever concealed behind the discretion that Wimsey's investigation and Inspector Grayson's restraint had afforded her. Wimsey himself never publicly disclosed the full details of the Marchmont case, though he made occasional reference to it in private conversations with those who possessed sufficient moral sophistication to understand the complexities that criminal investigation sometimes revealed. He would note that Edmund Marchmont's death represented a curious intersection of justice and crime, and that the most satisfactory resolutions were not always those that most perfectly adhered to the letter of the law. When pressed for elaboration, he would typically demur with a characteristic wave of his hand and a recitation of some classical quotation regarding the nature of vengeance or the limitations of human judgment. But those who knew him well recognized in such demurrals the reflection of a man who had encountered moral complexity that exceeded the capacity of any legal system to address with perfect justice, and who had chosen to respond to that complexity not with judgment, but with a carefully calibrated silence.